The satellite phone crackled through the dust storm as I huddled in my tent outside Kandahar. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, this is Marcus Webb from Heritage Coin Appraisals in Portland. I need to speak with you urgently about your grandfather's collection. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My heart stopped. Grandpa Otto's coins were the last thing I expected anyone to call about during my second deployment in Afghanistan. The connection was terrible, cutting in and out between static bursts, but his words came through clearly enough to make my blood run cold. Someone brought in your grandfather's 1916 Mercury dime, the one with the full split bands. They're claiming ownership, but your appraisal request from 6 months ago is still active in our system. 6 months ago? Before this deployment began? I had contacted Heritage Coin Appraisals about getting Grandpa Otto's collection properly valued for insurance purposes. He'd passed away 2 years earlier, and in his will, he'd specifically left his entire numismatic collection to me. Not to my older brother Derek, who'd always mocked his old man's hobby. Not to my sister Vanessa, who'd rolled her eyes whenever Grandpa talked about mint marks and error coins. To me, the granddaughter who'd spent countless Saturday afternoons learning about Walking Liberty half dollars and Morgan silver dollars. The collection wasn't just coins to me. It was our bond, our shared language of history and craftsmanship. While other kids played video games, I'd sit with Grandpa Otto at his kitchen table, carefully examining each piece under his magnifying lamp. He'd tell me stories about every coin's origin, its journey through American history, its significance beyond mere monetary value. The Mercury dime Marcus Webb was calling about wasn't just worth $3,000. It was the coin that had sparked my love for numismatics when I was 8 years old, the one Grandpa had let me hold with white cotton gloves while he explained why the full split bands made it so extraordinary. Now I was 8,000 miles away, serving my country, and someone was trying to sell my inheritance. "Mr. Webb," I managed to say through the static, "that dime belongs to me. My grandfather left me his entire collection in his will. Can you tell me who brought it in?" The pause on the other end felt eternal. "Ma'am, I think we need to discuss this in person when you return stateside. This isn't the first piece from your grandfather's collection that's come through our doors in recent weeks." My hands started shaking, and it wasn't from the desert cold. "What do you mean, not the first piece?" "We've seen the 1893 Morgan dollar, the 1909 VDB Lincoln cent, and now this Mercury dime. All pieces that match the detailed inventory you provided for your insurance appraisal. Someone has been systematically liquidating the collection." The tent felt like it was spinning around me. Those weren't just any coins. The 1893 Morgan dollar was Grandpa's crown jewel, worth over $30,000. The 1909 VDB Lincoln cent was the first coin he'd ever bought as a teenager with money from his paper route. Together, those 3 coins represented almost half the collection's total value. "Do you still have them? Can you hold them?" "I've already pulled them from sale and secured them in our vault. Ma'am, whoever is selling these has detailed knowledge of the collection. They knew exactly which pieces would bring the highest returns. This isn't random theft. This is calculated liquidation." My mind raced through the possibilities. My siblings had keys to Grandpa's house, which they were supposed to be preparing for sale. We'd agreed that the house contents would be divided according to the will, with me getting the coins, Derek getting the woodworking tools, and Vanessa getting the antique furniture. But I'd been deployed when Grandpa died, and again when it came time to actually clean out the house. I'd trusted them to handle everything properly, to keep my inheritance safe until I returned. Apparently, that trust had been catastrophically misplaced. "Mr. Webb, I need you to document everything. Every coin, every detail about who brought them in. I'll be back in the States in 3 weeks, and when I get there, I'm going to need all the evidence you can provide." "Of course, Lieutenant, but there's something else you should know. The person who brought in the Mercury dime today left quite an impression on my staff. They were asking detailed questions about other high-value coins from the same era. Specifically, they mentioned a 1916D Mercury dime and a 1921 peace dollar, both pieces that would logically be part of a serious collector's holdings. My stomach dropped. Those coins were indeed part of Grandpa's collection, stored in a separate safety deposit box that only I was supposed to have access to. If Derek and Vanessa knew about those pieces, it meant they'd been through more than just the house. They'd been through Grandpa's personal papers, found information I didn't even know existed. The worst part was the betrayal felt so calculated, so deliberate. This wasn't desperate siblings grabbing a few valuable items to help with funeral expenses. This was systematic liquidation of my inheritance while I was serving overseas, unable to defend what was rightfully mine. They'd waited until I was deployed, until I couldn't possibly interfere, and then they'd methodically sold off the most valuable pieces of a collection that represented 60 years of Grandpa Otto's passion and dedication. I thought about all those Saturday afternoons, all those stories about coin collecting being more than money. Grandpa had taught me that true numismatics was about preserving history, about understanding the artistry and craftsmanship that went into each piece. He'd always said that the real value wasn't in the price guides, but in the connection between collector and collection, in the responsibility to preserve these artifacts for future generations. Clearly, Derek and Vanessa had missed those lessons entirely. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was fighting for freedom and democracy abroad while my own family was stealing my freedom to inherit what Grandpa had specifically wanted me to have. I was protecting other people's rights while my own were being violated by the people who should have been protecting my interests. Mr. Webb's voice crackled through the static again. Lieutenant, there's one more thing. The person who brought in the Mercury dime today mentioned they had access to documentation proving the coin's provenance. They seemed very confident about their legal right to sell them. That stopped me cold. What kind of documentation? They mentioned having paperwork showing the collection had been divided among family members according to the deceased's wishes. I didn't examine the documents closely, but they seemed prepared for questions about ownership. My mind went into overdrive. The only way Derek and Vanessa could have documentation like that is if they'd forged something, or if there was some aspect of Grandpa's will I didn't know about. But I'd been present when the will was read, and the attorney had been very clear about the coin collection being left entirely to me. There had been no ambiguity, no room for interpretation. Unless there was something else. Some other document. Some other instruction I'd never heard of. The thought made me sick. What if Grandpa had changed his mind in his final months? What if there was a codicil to the will that I'd never seen? What if my siblings weren't thieves but legitimate inheritors of coins I'd assumed were mine? But even as the doubt crept in, I knew it was wrong. Grandpa Otto had been clear about his intentions. He'd talked about the collection being mine long before he'd ever gotten sick, long before there was any question of wills or inheritance. He'd spent years teaching me everything he knew because he wanted me to be the collection's next steward. That wasn't the kind of decision someone changes lightly. No, Derek and Vanessa were stealing from me, and they were using my deployment as cover. They'd counted on me being unreachable, unable to monitor what was happening back home. They'd assumed I'd never find out, or that by the time I did, it would be too late to do anything about it. They'd underestimated both my grandfather's wisdom and the coin-collecting community's integrity. Grandpa had taught me to always document everything, to always leave paper trails, to always work with reputable dealers who kept meticulous records. His lessons were about to save his collection from the very people who should have been protecting it. 3 weeks of sleepless nights later, I was finally back on American soil, but instead of the relief I'd expected to feel, there was only cold determination coursing through my veins. The flight from Germany to Portland had given me 18 hours to plan my approach, and I'd used every minute to map out exactly how I was going to handle Derek and Vanessa. They thought my deployment had made me powerless. They were about to learn how wrong they'd been. Marcus Webb's coin shop sat in a restored Victorian building in Portland's Pearl District, the kind of place that whispered old money and serious collectors. Through the window, I could see display cases filled with Morgan dollars and Walking Liberty halves, each piece carefully lit and documented. This wasn't some pawn shop operation. This was where legitimate numismatics did business, where provenance mattered and documentation was everything. The bell above the door chimed as I entered, still wearing my dress uniform. I'd come straight from the airport because I wanted Derek and Vanessa to see exactly what they'd been betraying. Marcus Webb looked up from behind the counter, a thin man in his 60s with the careful hands and magnifying glass of someone who'd spent decades examining precious metals and mint marks. Lieutenant Mitchell, I assume. His voice carried the same gravity it had over the satellite phone. "Thank you for coming so quickly. We have a great deal to discuss." Before I could respond, voices from the back room made my blood freeze. Derek's loud laugh, the same one he'd used to mock Grandpa's hobby at every family gathering. Vanessa's sharp tone, probably negotiating prices like she was selling furniture at a garage sale instead of liquidating pieces of American numismatic history. "They're here now," I said, and it wasn't a question. Marcus nodded grimly. "They called this morning asking about additional pieces. Apparently they found more coins in a safety deposit box. They're in my office examining them with my assistant." The safety deposit box. The one I'd never seen opened, the one Grandpa had mentioned in passing but never shown me. The one that apparently held the most valuable pieces of his collection, the ones he'd kept separate even from his regular holdings. Derek and Vanessa had somehow gained access to that too. I want to hear what they're saying before they see me. Marcus led me quietly toward the back where we could hear Derek's voice through the partially open door. He was explaining the coin's history to Marcus's assistant, getting every detail wrong. "This one here, the peace dollar, my grandfather bought it in 1975 as an investment. Never really cared about the collecting side, just wanted something that would hold value. We're liquidating the estate to split the proceeds 3 ways, like he would have wanted." Like he would have wanted? The lie was so brazen it took my breath away. Grandpa Otto had never bought a single coin as a mere investment. Every piece in his collection had been chosen for its historical significance, its condition, its place in the broader story of American currency. The 1921 peace dollar Derek was describing wasn't just valuable because of its silver content, it was significant because it marked the end of World War I, the beginning of a new era of American prosperity. Grandpa had spent 45 minutes explaining that to me when I was 12 years old. Vanessa's voice joined in, equally confident in her fabrications. "Sarah was always overseas anyway, never really part of the family decisions. She's career military, doesn't need sentimental keepsakes. Better to convert everything to cash so we can all benefit equally." Never part of the family decisions? I'd been deployed twice in 4 years, serving my country, and somehow that made me less family than the siblings who had rarely visited Grandpa unless they needed money. I'd spent every leave checking on him, making sure his medications were organized, driving him to doctor's appointments when Derek and Vanessa were too busy with their own lives. Marcus touched my shoulder gently. "There's something else you need to know before you confront them. Something about the documentation they provided." He led me to a different office, closing the door behind us. From a locked filing cabinet, he pulled out a folder thick with papers. They brought copies of what appears to be a revised will dated just 3 months before your grandfather's death. According to this document, the coin collection was to be divided equally among all 3 grandchildren, with specific high-value pieces to be sold and the proceeds distributed. The room spun around me. A revised will? But I'd been present when the original will was read, and there had been no mention of any changes. I examined the documents carefully with my legal team before calling you. The signature matches samples we have on file, the notarization appears legitimate, but something felt off about the circumstances. So I did some investigating. He opened another folder, this one containing medical records and nursing home documentation. Your grandfather was in the advanced stages of dementia 3 months before his death. According to his medical team, he wasn't competent to make legal decisions during that period. He couldn't remember basic information about his own life, let alone make complex decisions about inheritance distribution. The betrayal cut deeper than I'd imagined possible.
Derek and Vanessa hadn't just stolen from me while I was deployed, they'd taken advantage of Grandpa's deteriorating mental state to manufacture documents that would give them legal cover for their theft. They'd watched their grandfather lose his memory, his connection to the world he'd known, and they'd used that vulnerability to rewrite his final wishes. There's more, Marcus continued. I contacted the attorney who supposedly witnessed this revised will. He died 2 years ago, conveniently before anyone could question the document's authenticity. The notary whose stamp appears on the paperwork claims to have no record of the transaction. So it's forged. Expertly forged, but yes, someone spent considerable time and money creating documents that would hold up to casual scrutiny. This wasn't a desperate grab for quick cash. This was a planned operation designed to legally justify the liquidation of your inheritance. The calculating nature of it made my stomach turn. Derek and Vanessa had watched me deploy overseas, watched Grandpa's mind fade, and they'd seen an opportunity to rewrite history in their favor. I thought about all the times I called home during my deployment, asking Derek and Vanessa to check on Grandpa, to make sure he was taking his medications and eating properly. They'd assured me everything was fine, that they were handling all the details, that I shouldn't worry about things back home. Meanwhile, they were systematically preparing to steal everything Grandpa had wanted me to have. The cruelest part was how they'd twisted his memory loss into an opportunity. Grandpa Otto had always been sharp, organized, meticulous about his record keeping. The idea that he'd suddenly decide to divide his beloved collection equally among grandchildren who had never shown the slightest interest in numismatics was absurd.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
But in his final months, when dementia had stolen his ability to advocate for himself, Derek and Vanessa had created a new version of his wishes that served their financial interests. We need to confront them now, while they're here with the coins. I want to see their faces when they realize their plan has failed. Marcus nodded and handed me a digital recorder. For documentation purposes, everything they say from this point forward needs to be preserved for the legal proceedings that will inevitably follow. As we walked back toward his office, I could hear Derek explaining to the assistant how their grandfather had always planned for the collection to be liquidated after his death, how he'd never intended for any single person to inherit such valuable items, how the family had decided unanimously that selling everything was the most equitable solution. Every word was a lie, and they were delivering it with the confidence of people who'd never expected to be challenged. They'd assumed I would accept their version of events, that my respect for family harmony would prevent me from questioning their authority. They'd counted on my military training to make me compliant with orders from older siblings, never realizing that same training had taught me to recognize and resist enemy tactics. Derek and Vanessa had declared war on my inheritance and my grandfather's memory. They'd used his vulnerability and my absence as weapons against both of us. But they'd made one crucial miscalculation. They'd assumed that Grandpa Otto hadn't taught me anything beyond coin collecting. They'd forgotten that he'd also taught me about honor, integrity, and fighting for what's right. Marcus opened the door to his office, and I stepped inside to face the two people who'd systematically betrayed everything Grandpa Otto had stood for. Derek looked up first, his face cycling through surprise, guilt, and finally settling on defensive anger. Vanessa's expression was harder to read, but I caught the flash of calculation in her eyes as she quickly assessed how much trouble she was in. "Sarah," Derek said, standing up and attempting his usual charm offensive. "What a surprise! When did you get back?" "We were just handling some of Grandpa's affairs, making sure everything was properly valued for estate purposes." The casual lie, delivered with a smile, confirmed everything I needed to know about who I was dealing with. These weren't my loving siblings making difficult family decisions. These were thieves who'd been caught red-handed and were now scrambling to maintain their cover story. I looked at the coins spread across Marcus's examination table. The 1916D Mercury dime that Grandpa had searched for over 20 years. The 1921 peace dollar that had sparked his interest in commemorative issues. The 1893 S. Morgan that he'd called the queen of his collection. Each piece represented hours of his passion, years of careful preservation, decades of dedication to the craft of numismatics. Now they were just merchandise to Derek and Vanessa, valuable items to be converted to cash and divided among people who had no appreciation for their historical significance or emotional weight. Estate purposes? I repeated, my voice steady despite the rage building inside me. Is that what you call systematically selling off pieces from a collection that was specifically left to me? Derek's confident smile faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. Sarah, you're being dramatic. Grandpa always said the collection should benefit the whole family eventually. We're just making sure that happens in the most practical way. Really? I pulled out my phone, where I'd saved photos of every page of Grandpa's original will, because according to this document, witnessed by 3 people and notarized by Attorney Reynolds, the entire numismatic collection was left to me, Sarah Elena Mitchell, with no conditions and no stipulations about sharing or selling. Vanessa stood up, her jaw set in the stubborn expression I remembered from childhood arguments. Wills can be changed, Sarah. People's final wishes aren't always captured in old documents. Grandpa had second thoughts about leaving such valuable items to someone who's never home. Never home because I was serving my country, the same country whose currency these coins represent, whose history they preserve. But I suppose that distinction is lost on people who see everything as a commodity to be liquidated. Marcus Webb stepped forward, his professional demeanor hiding what I suspected was deep disapproval of my siblings' behavior. I think there are some things about your grandfather's collection that you might not be aware of, things that explain why he was so specific about Sarah being the sole inheritor. What are you talking about? Derek's voice had an edge now, the charm completely abandoned. Marcus moved to a different cabinet, one I hadn't noticed before, and withdrew a thick leather portfolio. Your grandfather didn't just collect coins, he documented everything. Every purchase, every trade, every story behind every piece. But more than that, he documented why he was building this collection and who he intended to pass it to. He opened the portfolio, revealing pages of handwritten notes in Grandpa Otto's careful script. The top page was titled, "For Sarah, the real story behind the collection." Your grandfather started collecting coins when he was 8 years old during the Great Depression. His father had lost his job and the family was struggling to survive. One day, Otto found a 1909 S VDB penny in the street, and when he showed it to a local coin dealer, he discovered it was worth more than his father made in a week. Marcus turned the page, revealing a photograph of a young boy holding that same penny, his face beaming with pride and wonder. That discovery changed his life, not because of the money, but because it showed him that history lived in everyday objects, that ordinary things could have extraordinary stories. He spent the next 70 years building this collection, not as an investment, but as a library of American history told through its currency. I looked at Derek and Vanessa, watching their expressions shift from confident to confused to increasingly uncomfortable. They'd never heard this story. They'd never asked about it. But there's more, Marcus continued. Your grandfather was a code breaker during World War II. He worked with military intelligence, deciphering enemy communications that helped save thousands of Allied lives. After the war, he came home with a deep appreciation for the importance of preserving information for future generations. He turned to another section of the portfolio, revealing military commendations I'd never seen before, citations for bravery and service that Grandpa had never mentioned. Next to them were letters, dozens of them, written in his hand, but addressed to me. Sarah, the first letter began, if you're reading this, then my collection has found its way home to you, just as I always planned.
These coins aren't just metal and history. They're lessons in perseverance, in finding value where others see only ordinary objects, in understanding that the most important inheritances aren't money, but knowledge and responsibility. My eyes blurred as I continued reading. You've inherited more than my passion for numismatics. You've inherited my belief that serving something larger than yourself is the highest calling. Your military service honors not just your country, but every story these coins represent, every sacrifice they commemorate. Marcus turned more pages, revealing detailed notes about my childhood visits, my questions about mint marks and error coins, my genuine fascination with the craftsmanship and artistry behind each piece. Grandpa had documented everything, creating a record of why he'd chosen me as his successor. Your siblings never showed interest, Marcus read from another page. Derek sees only monetary value, Vanessa sees only status symbols, but Sarah sees history, sees artistry, sees the human stories behind every piece. She understands that being a custodian of these treasures is both a privilege and a responsibility. Derek's face had gone pale. How long have you had that? Your grandfather brought it to me 6 months before he passed away, while his mind was still sharp and his intentions were clear. He was concerned about his deteriorating health and wanted to ensure there would be documentation of his wishes beyond just the legal will. So, you've known all along that we were the legitimate inheritors? Vanessa's voice was desperate now, grasping for any justification for their actions.
On the contrary, I've known all along that Sarah was the sole intended inheritor, and that any attempts to claim otherwise were fraudulent. Your grandfather specifically predicted that you might try to challenge his decision, which is why he created this documentation, and why he asked me to safeguard the most valuable pieces. Wait, I said, understanding dawning. You've been holding back coins from them? Marcus smiled for the first time since I'd arrived. The pieces they've been selling represent about 30% of the collection's total value. Your grandfather moved the most significant pieces to my vault months before his death, with instructions that they were only to be released to you, in person, with proper identification. He led us to another room where a massive safe dominated one wall. Inside were display cases containing coins that took my breath away, Morgan dollars in pristine condition, Mercury dimes that seemed to glow under the specialized lighting, walking Liberty halves that looked like they'd been minted yesterday. The crown jewel was a 1933 double eagle, worth more than most people's houses. Derek and Vanessa stared in shock at the magnitude of what they'd never had access to. All their scheming, all their forged documents, all their systematic theft had netted them the smaller pieces while the real treasures remained safely beyond their reach. "This changes everything," Derek said quietly. "If we'd known there were more valuable pieces—" "It doesn't change anything," I interrupted. "Even if these coins hadn't existed, you still stole from me. You still forged documents and took advantage of Grandpa's illness. You still betrayed not just me, but everything he believed in." "Sarah, be reasonable," Vanessa pleaded. "We're family. Surely we can work out some kind of arrangement." "We were family when you decided to rob me while I was deployed. We were family when you forged legal documents to justify theft. We were family when you sold pieces of American history to fund your lifestyle. But family doesn't steal from family, and family doesn't dishonor the wishes of the dead." Marcus handed me a set of keys. "These access the safety deposit box where your grandfather stored his research notes and acquisition records. Everything you need to understand not just what you've inherited, but why you've inherited it." I turned back to Derek and Vanessa, who were now looking at each other with the panicked expressions of people realizing their plan had completely backfired. "You're going to return every coin you've sold, or you're going to reimburse me for their full market value. You're going to turn over the keys to Grandpa's house and never set foot on that property again. And you're going to sign statements admitting that you forged documents and stole from me." "Or what?" Derek tried one last bluff. "You'll sue your own family?"
I'll have you prosecuted for elder abuse, fraud, forgery, and theft. I'll make sure everyone in this family knows exactly what you did to Grandpa while he was helpless and what you did to me while I was serving overseas. And I'll make sure that every coin dealer in the Pacific Northwest knows to refuse business with both of you." The fight went out of them then, the reality of their situation finally sinking in. They'd committed multiple felonies in pursuit of money that was never theirs to begin with, and they'd been caught by the very community they'd tried to exploit. 6 months later, I had the entire collection properly cataloged and insured. The coins Derek and Vanessa had sold were recovered and returned, their buyers compensated through funds seized from my siblings' bank accounts. The forged will led to criminal charges that resulted in probation and community service, but more importantly, it led to permanent estrangement from family members who'd proven they cared more about money than integrity. But the real victory wasn't legal or financial. It was sitting in my apartment every evening, reading through Grandpa Otto's research notes and understanding that I'd inherited more than coins. I'd inherited his passion for preservation, his respect for history, his belief that some things are worth more than their monetary value. Every Saturday now, I volunteer at the local Veterans Center, teaching other military families about numismatics and coin collecting. I share Grandpa's stories about finding value in unexpected places, about the importance of preserving history for future generations, about understanding that true inheritance isn't what you take, but what you protect. The 1933 Double Eagle sits in my living room now, not locked away in a vault, but displayed where I can see it every day. It reminds me that sometimes the most valuable things in life are the ones that survived against all odds, that were preserved by people who understood their worth went beyond mere economics. Derek and Vanessa got their inheritance, after all, just not the one they'd planned on. They inherited the knowledge that greed ultimately destroys the very things it seeks to possess, and that family bonds built on shared values are worth more than any collection of precious metals. As for me, I inherited Grandpa Otto's legacy exactly as he intended. Not just his coins, but his wisdom. Not just his collection, but his commitment to being a custodian of history. And most importantly, the understanding that serving something larger than yourself, whether it's your country, your family, or the preservation of knowledge, is the highest form of honor. The morning light streams through my kitchen window as I sit at the same wooden table where Grandpa Otto once taught me about mint marks and proof sets. The 1916 D Mercury dime rests in my palm, its silver surface catching the early sunshine just as it did all those years ago when I was 8 years old and everything seemed possible. My coffee grows cold as I read through another of his handwritten letters, this one explaining how he'd chosen each piece not for its investment potential, but for the story it told about American resilience. The 1943 steel penny from wartime rationing, the Eisenhower dollars commemorating space exploration, the bicentennial quarters celebrating 200 years of independence. Each coin represents a moment when our nation faced challenges and emerged stronger. The doorbell interrupts my morning ritual. Through the peephole, I see a young girl, maybe 10 years old, standing beside her grandfather. He's holding a small velvet pouch, the kind serious collectors use to transport their most precious pieces. I open the door to find Thomas Chen, the elderly man who'd been corresponding with me about my grandfather's wartime service. His granddaughter Amy shifts nervously beside him, clutching what appears to be a junior numismatics handbook. "Lieutenant Mitchell," Thomas says with a slight bow, "I hope we're not intruding, but Amy has something she'd like to show you. She's been collecting state quarters since she was 6, and when I told you about your grandfather's collection, she insisted on meeting you." Amy steps forward, her eyes wide with the same wonder I remember feeling at her age. She opens her pouch to reveal a perfectly preserved 1999 Delaware quarter, the first in the state quarter series. "Miss Mitchell, my grandpa says your grandfather served in the war with my great-grandfather. They were friends before they both came home and started collecting coins." The connection takes my breath away. Grandpa Otto had mentioned fellow collectors from his military days, men who'd found solace in numismatics after witnessing the horrors of war. To think that their friendship had survived across generations, that their shared passion was still bringing families together decades later, felt like validation of every choice I'd made. "Would you like to see some of my grandfather's collection?" I ask Amy, whose face lights up like Christmas morning. As I lead them to my display cases, I think about Derek and Vanessa, probably sitting in their suburban homes, wondering if their lives might have been richer if they'd chosen curiosity over greed. They'd missed the opportunity to be part of something larger than themselves, to connect with history and community in ways that money could never provide. Amy gasps when she sees the 1933 double eagle, her small fingers pressed against the glass case as she studies every detail. She asks questions that remind me of my younger self, questions about craftsmanship and historical significance that have nothing to do with monetary value and everything to do with genuine fascination. Thomas watches his granddaughter with the same pride I remember seeing in Grandpa Otto's eyes. This is how legacies survive, not through force or legal documents, but through shared wonder and the patient passing of knowledge from one generation to the next. Before they leave, I give Amy a magnifying glass that once belonged to my grandfather, along with his beginner's guide to coin collecting. Her promise to take care of both makes me understand that Grandpa Otto's real inheritance wasn't the coins themselves, but the responsibility to nurture the next generation of stewards. Standing in my doorway, watching Amy skip down the sidewalk while carefully cradling her new treasures, I finally understand what Grandpa meant when he said the greatest collections live beyond their original owners. His coins will outlive me, just as his lessons will outlive his coins, creating ripples of curiosity and respect that extend far beyond anything Derek and Vanessa could have imagined when they tried to reduce it all to cash. The morning sun catches the Mercury dime still in my hand, and for a moment, I can almost hear Grandpa Otto reminding me that some treasures are meant to be shared, not hoarded, that the real value of any inheritance lies not in what you keep, but what you pass forward. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.